I am beyond elated to be with you, and I really mean that. In large part because you are modeling what we need in this moment. And really, let me just drill down on what I mean. Where the country is, particularly post the 2024 election, you all were there, okay? You understand what happened. There's a number of different approaches that people have taken. And I'll be honest with this group to say that the first approach was really where I found myself initially, and that was in a fetal position at home, wanting to, stay under the covers. And I often say, depending on the thread count of your sheets, staying at home, putting your heads under the covers, that might be a really nice place to be. But what you all are modeling is really what America is at her core. We really complicate America's story, and I actually don't think it's that complicated, though it has twists and turns. The story of America is people coming together just like we are today. The methods have changed, the venues have changed, but as American as apple pie is this idea that we get to decide what we want our communities to be. That people come together in barns, in basements, in bars, in Zoom rooms, to have serious conversations about what we believe we deserve and about what we want to see our government do, frankly, in our name. I know that all of us on this call have been horrified by the constant images that is coming out of our cities, particularly because of the outrageous and frankly illegal, hear me on this, illegal activities that we're seeing from ICE. All of us heart-stricken by what happened to Renee Good and how a mom was shot and killed in front of her wife as she tried to flee. And then just days later, a week later, Alex Preddy and his murder that we all had to watch on video. But I will tell you, this week I was with my colleagues because I've been leading the charge in Pennsylvania on legislation to rein in ICE. And I want to talk about one of those pieces of legislation today. But I read a story about a little girl named Amelia, 1 year old, 1 year old, who has been trapped in an ICE detainment facility in Texas, being treated like a criminal, not given access to the medication that she needs because of some health issues that she has. And now in that facility in Texas, they are taking the notes that kids are writing, telling their stories from that facility after Amelia's story broke. We have a 1 year old child who is being held as if she is a terrorist, a baby who has done nothing to anyone and is not a threat, is not one of the criminals that this guy promised to go after, but a 1 year old baby that is being held in ways that are inhumane, unconscionable. And so in the face of all of that, you give me so much encouragement because we could take these moments and collectively isolate and ruminate in our feelings and our justified emotions and the pain that this moment is bringing up and dredging up every single day. But what Mona just mentioned, what Jill was talking about, is you have millions of women who are saying, not on my watch. Millions of women who are getting engaged in the great American tradition of demanding better and pulling this country, a lot of times kicking and screaming, closer to the ideas of freedom, justice, and fairness, making these words that we preserve in these beautiful documents here in Philadelphia, making these words actually mean something, make them mean something. As we sit here today, thinking about what's happening in the country, we're also sitting here during what is the 100th anniversary of what is now known as Black History Month, began as Black History Week. And there are two individuals who I've been thinking about a lot in this moment. The first is Congressman Smalls, and many of you may know the story of Congressman Smalls. But Congressman Smalls was an enslaved man working as a pilot on a ship during the Civil War. He's in South Carolina. He's piloting this ship. Everybody on the ship in the Confederacy loves him. And little do they know, Congressman Smalls was planning what ended up being one of the most daring escapes, and in many ways turned the tide of the war that at that point was incredibly bloody. Over 280,000 Americans on both sides had been killed at that point. The Union Army was in many ways losing, even though battle lines weren't changing that much. And Congressman Smalls got together with the other Black folks on that ship. They got the crew to go off and have some drinks. They sent them off to a bar. And they piloted that ship in the dead of night through 5 checkpoints, just 10 miles, but 5 checkpoints, pretending that they were the captain of the ship, dressed themselves as the captain of the ship, turned that ship over to the Union Army, and turned the tide of the war, in part because of the information that he was able to share about the supply lines of the troops in South Carolina, which was a key naval point of entry and logistical hub for the Southern troops at the time. And Congressman Smalls went on to become Congressman Smalls, one of the first Black congressmen to serve in the United States Congress, and had a long, illustrious career. But in this moment where we are up against very much our own version of a cold civil war, it is requiring a lot of people who I'm seeing in North Carolina and Iowa and other places, as I see here on this call, to be behind enemy lines, so to speak, organizing in places that are not very friendly territory to organize. And so I'm going to highlight you and say thank you for what you are doing behind those enemy lines and ensuring that Democrats are doing the hard work to change the trajectory in some of those communities. And I know that there's a lot of work to do, but we ought to be patting ourselves on the back about what we have done so far, because it's not just the special election in Pennsylvania that we flipped early on in the Trump administration, where we flipped a state Senate seat that Democrats had not held for decades. It's not just the state Senate seat that we flipped in Iowa, breaking the supermajority in the Iowa State Senate. It's not just the Senate seat that we flipped down in Texas, flipping a district that Donald Trump had just won by 17 points months ago, winning it by 14 points. And if you can do some quick math, that's a 31-point swing in a part of Texas where Democrats had been counted out and left for dead. You all are doing that. You all are doing that behind enemy lines. But what I've also been thinking about in the spirit of Black History Month, in the spirit of Congressman Smalls, is history that dates back about 61 years ago, where the great John Lewis and many others did their famous march across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And I know all of you on this call are far too young to remember this story, but let me remind you of this story. And I want to remind you because I think in this moment where right now as we're speaking, the Trump administration is being forced to put back up the panels in Old City, Philadelphia at the president's house, honoring the legacy of the enslaved individuals who served in that house and who were foundational in building this country that we are doing the hard work to perfect. They're putting those panels back up. And so do not buy this idea that they are unstoppable, that Trump is unbeatable. You all are beating him, and you're beating him in places that no one thought was possible for us to win. You are doing that. And what's exciting about that, and what I've been sharing with people as I go across the country and frankly across the world for the Democratic Party, in just a year since I've been vice chair of our party, I've gone to 4 countries 27 states, and done 150 plus events at this point. I think 153 events at this point, building this party with you all. But a story that I've been sharing everywhere I go is the story about the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And I've been saying to folks that we see what Trump is doing to try to deny history, to try to whitewash history, to try to remove the story of who we are. But we should be very clear that sometimes what happens, even among friends, is that we can flatten history. It's very easy to make a long story about a central character, right? If you want to tell a long story, it's certainly a long story about the Edmund Pettus Bridge, you make it about the late, great John Lewis and his admonition to get into good trouble. And you make that story about him and the other superhuman individuals who went on that bridge and changed the course of history through the sheer force of will. But we should be very clear about the truth of what was happening when they did that march. 61 years ago, when they did that march, Gallup, who used to still poll, okay, I know they're no longer doing it, but back when Gallup was polling, 19% of the American public supported what they were doing on that bridge that day before they marched. 19%. I know that you don't have a lot of people now celebrating that they voted for George Wallace, but we should be very clear. George Wallace was elected. He was elected popularly. He won pretty big. And then he went on to famously say at his inauguration, segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. And so that is who they were going up against, the guy who had won an election that a lot of people did not want him to win, but he won. The public polling at the time was saying that the fight for civil rights, for extended women's rights, was not a fight that a majority of the American public supported. And even the individuals who supported, and I want to be very clear, even Black folks who said they supported the concept of civil rights, 35% of them polled said that they thought that these folks were going too fast, that they were asking for too much, that by virtue of showing up on that bridge, they were going to inflame tensions. And so maybe they ought to have less Zooms. Maybe they ought to have less conversations. Maybe they ought to do a little bit less. So I tell you that and give you that framework because the individuals who showed up that day, changing the course of history, did not do so with a crystal ball, knowing that what they were going to do was going to lead to the passage of the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act, which are under attack right now. All they knew for sure is what you know, that we have something that is worth fighting for. Something that is worth fighting for. You know, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And it's rhyming, isn't it? We have a guy in the White House who sounds very similar to George Wallace, who's using law enforcement very similarly to how George Wallace was using it. Not to protect our fellow citizens, not to make our communities safer, not to go after the gang members and the criminals, but to terrorize people who are demanding more from their government. And so when they marched across that bridge, I know John Lewis gets a lot of credit that he deserves, but we should be very clear, John Lewis was not there alone. 600 people showed up that day. Homemakers, nurses, pastors, lawyers, people who had to give up a lot by showing up. You read some of the stories of people who showed up at that march, many of whom were not able to go back home to their communities because people in their neighborhoods were upset with them for daring to show up and demand civil rights for all people. So I tell you that because so often, as vice chair of our party, I am asked consistently, well, Malcolm, who's going to be the next John Lewis? Who's going to be the next Barack Obama? Who's going to be the next this person? And too often we get caught up in the cult of personality. I'm not asking you to join my cult, okay? My husband loves me very much. He would not join my cult. And if he wouldn't join, you certainly shouldn't be trying to take up membership. And we ought not be in the business of searching for Godot and believing that the next great person is going to be the person that's going to come and save this country. In this moment, I'm urging us, I am begging us as Democrats, and frankly, put aside Democrats, I am begging us as Americans to not sit on the sidelines waiting for somebody else to get on the bridge This is our chance to just get on the damn bridge. To not ask who's going to get the credit in the history books, but to just get on the damn bridge. To not worry who's going to get the great quote in the saying of good trouble or whatever the next rallying cry will be. Just get on the damn bridge because you believe there is something worth fighting for, not just against, something worth fighting for. I happen to believe, and please, nobody pass out on me, but I happen to believe that in the greatest country to ever exist, we can actually ensure that every single person has access to high quality healthcare and the ability to afford their prescriptions when they leave the appointment. We can do that here in America, and do not believe the noise that we cannot do it. We can do it here. I believe that in the greatest country to ever exist, we can ensure that young people my generation can buy that first home. And you know what? When I'm lucky enough to retire, that you can retire in the home where you raised your kids. I believe that we can do that in this country. I believe that in this country, we can grapple with the existential societal change that is going to come from AI and have real conversations about restrictions around data centers and where they're placed and how they're placed and the energy usage of those centers. We can have serious conversations about universal basic income and how we deal with the loss of employment that is going to come from this new tool. And we can do it without demonizing anybody, without stoking fear. We can have a serious conversation about it when we have serious leaders who are looking toward the future and want to solve problems. Believe that in this country, we can actually be in a position where we invest in law enforcement, respect law enforcement, but also hold law enforcement to the same standard of law and order that we want for people in our communities. That means we don't need law enforcement with masks grabbing people off of the streets in unmarked vehicles. That is not who we are as Americans, and we can do better than that. And you know what? I happen to believe in America, we can ensure that every eligible voter can vote, that people who don't have the right to vote are kept out of our election system, and we can do it without passing the SAVE Act and pushing millions of American women off of the voter roll because they don't have a passport, a birth certificate, and 19 forms of identification. We can do that together. So I say all of this to really end where I began. You all are modeling the behavior that has always pushed this country forward. The folks who, in the dead of night, did daring ship raids during the Civil War. The folks during the height of the civil rights movement who just got on the damn bridge. The women of the suffragette movement who tied themselves to the fence of the White House that he's now tearing down because they understood that this country could only be great if everybody could participate. And you're also modeling something for the future. I will end with something I briefly said at the Democratic Convention. My grandmother, Mary Kenyatta, was a civil rights leader and icon. She organized with the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, did so much other incredible work throughout her life. But I will never forget calling this woman whose spine is reinforced with steel, to hear her crying on the other side of the line, to tell me that she was worried that all the work she had done, all the sacrifices that she had made seemed to be for naught. And I said something to her that I say to myself in the mirror and that I said to the entire country when I stood on the stage of the Democratic Convention. It's just our turn. And that is true. It is our turn to ensure that this experiment in self-government does not die on our watch. And I am confident that because of what you are doing, it won't die on our watch. I'm grateful. I'm so grateful for you. So God bless you. Thank you all so much for having me. And thank you for what you do every single day.
Thank you so much, Malcolm. I know you have a hard stop, but I'm just wondering, do you have a minute for a question? Or do you
Yeah,
need
please. Yeah, I do. I do have a hard stop, but if we could do this, if it's okay, I thought I'd take two questions and then I'll respond to both in just, one sort of sum up. Does that work?
Yeah, that's great. So we have a
Okay.
couple questions in the chat about the
Oh, perfect.
and Mega Act, which you might be able to combine. And then I think just speaking quickly to the work the DNC is doing, that sort of maybe not everybody has their, finger on. We're not
That's
going to take any
perfect.
live questions. So if anybody raised their hand, sorry, those were the two.
Great. No, that's absolutely perfect. And I'll start with your second one. And this is so important what I'm about to say because um, if you don't know somebody's job description, then you're never going to be able to judge their performance effectively. And so I think a part of the challenge we face right now at the DNC, and I'll be straightforward about that challenge, is that too few people know what the DNC actually does. And so people are saying, well, why don't you do this or do that? And it's like, oh, because it's not our thing to do. And it's not a abdication of responsibility. It's understanding our role and actually putting our resources, and I don't just mean that financially, I mean the resources of our staff, of our energy into the things that we actually control. It is upsetting to me, and maybe some of you share my frustration sometimes with the approach of congressional leaders, particularly in the US Senate on our side. We should be clear about that. And some of the decisions that they're making in a moment that is existential. I don't see enough people in DC treating this existential moment like it's existential. You can't call it existential and then say we're going to do the same thing we've been doing for 30 years. So that, unfortunately, is one of the things that we don't control. We don't get to control how legislation moves on the Hill or the decisions that independently elected officials make on a daily basis. And so if you grade us based off of that, we're going to fail because that's not work that we can do. But if you look at the work that we can actually do, I hope that people are incredibly proud of what we've done in the last year because the DNC's job is very simple. Our job is to build the election infrastructure for our candidates to win. That is our job, full stop. And I'm incredibly proud of what we have done. And we see the election results. And I'm going to pat myself on the back and not be a self deprecating Democrat who says we can never celebrate our victories. We ought to celebrate the things that we are doing. Last year, Democrats won 89.3% or overperformed 89.3% of elections. 89.3%. That is the highest success rate in the history of the Democratic Party. The highest success rate in the history of the Democratic Party. And you know what? We ought to celebrate that because it communicates that the work that we are doing is not just screaming into a void. The work that we are doing is changing hearts and minds and changing the actual voting behavior of a lot of people who either sat out the election or gave this guy a chance. We should be proud of that. That number is actually 92% if you look at just special elections alone, where we have vastly overperformed any other previous years in off-cycle elections. That's the first thing I want to. The second thing that we've done is to actually build out the infrastructure pieces that are going to be necessary for us to succeed. And so I want to highlight just two of those infrastructure pieces. The first is voter registration. When I ran for vice chair and when Ken Martin ran to be chair of our party, he and I agreed on the need for the DNC to no longer leave voter registration only to 501c3 and 501c4 nonprofits. And that is what we had done for over a decade. The DNC basically walked away from registering voters and left it to nonprofits. And what has been the impact of that? The impact of that is that a lot more people have been getting registered as independents, even though they vote with the Democrats. And the justification for that is pretty simple. When you're registering somebody to vote, or when states like Minnesota or others automatically register people to vote, that's a good thing. But most people will just do the thing that's easiest to do. And it's easiest to just let the DMV make you an independent, as we do in Pennsylvania now. You go in, it'll just register you. And most people don't go in and select. They just accept the registration. It automatically registers as an independent. We have to change that. And here in Pennsylvania, because of Mona and so many others, Pennsylvania has seen 5 straight months of voter registration gains. This is for the first time in a year and a half. So this is a big deal. And this is a big shift for us. And it's an important shift. But we're not just leaving it to chance. The DNC launched a new program called When We Count. This is the first and the most, when I say the largest investment, I mean in terms of staff and money, the largest investment we have made in the history of the Democratic Party into registering people to vote. And the When We Count Fellowship, which I can get you more information about, is the tip of the spear of that work. The second thing that we've done from an infrastructure building perspective is actually get more staff trained. Many of you have probably done supporter housing for presidential campaigns for people who are coming in as organizers. The concern over the years has been people come into communities, they know nothing about the community they're organizing in, and they come in with very little information beyond a rudimentary understanding of how to use Van on how to actually organize on the ground. And so the DNC is rolling out the first of its kind regional training boot camps. These will be happening all across the country. I can also get you the information on this if you have people who are interested in joining these regional boot camps, where we have hired the first ever national training director. She is incredible. Her name is Megan. You will fall in love with her. And she is training staff at every single level, not just focused on who's going to, run for Senate or U.S. House, but actually focused in on how do we get people to be campaign managers for school board races? How do we get people who can be finance directors for mayoral campaigns? That type of infrastructure building that shifts the paradigm from the president is the most important and everything else doesn't matter. We're shifting that paradigm at the DNC to say the school board has to be treated with the same respect that we treat people running for US Senate. That people running to be on our state committee need to be given the same resources and access to information as people who are going to run for governor. Because if you can't win a school board race or a mayoral race, let me break this to you, you're going to have a really difficult time trying to run a presidential race in these states. So we have to build out that infrastructure. And those are just two of the things that we're doing on the infrastructure piece. On the SAVE Act, I want to again pat ourselves on the back here, not just the DNC, but all of us collectively as Democrats. Donald Trump is losing in court a lot. I know he does a lot of illegal things, and so it's like difficult to keep track of all the times that he's losing. But the president's monument, the president's house monument, is a perfect example. He went in against the law, tore down the signs, but you know what? Those signs are back up. They're back up because Democrats sued. Our mayor here, Sherelle Parker, sued. The governor, Josh Shapiro, supported that lawsuit. House Democrats also filed an amicus brief, and that is back up. But we've also done the same thing on elections, and in ways that I think have gone over the heads of a lot of the traditional press. And that's why you all are so important to get out and tell that story. The Democratic Party on day one, when we took over, the first thing we did was file a lawsuit challenging the president's executive order. If people paid attention to his executive orders, the first executive order he signed was to take over the Federal Elections Commission. And now he's threatening to sign executive orders on voter ID and all these other things. The DNC took him to court. We led that lawsuit. We won just last week. We won that lawsuit. And the judge not only said we won, but she ruled in our favor with prejudice, saying that they cannot bring back this exact same lawsuit again. That is a big deal to get a lawsuit like that. And it should be no doubt that our lead lawyer is an incredible woman named Andy, who is leading this litigation with an incredible team. But we won that lawsuit. We led the litigation of that lawsuit. Today, the DNC also filed suit against it was yesterday. We filed suit against the RNC, which is trying to, in the state of Michigan, make it more difficult for our veterans and military service personnel and their families to vote. And so for people who want to talk about loving America, there is nothing less American than saying to our troops who are in harm's way that they have no right to weigh in on the electoral process. So Republicans won't stand up for our troops, but the Democratic Party is going to stand up for our troops. And we are suing them right now to end what they are trying to do. Final piece is on the SAVE Act. And I'm incredibly disappointed, to be honest with you, that my senator, here in Pennsylvania, is the only Democrat so far who has said he is going to support the SAVE Act legislation that he had promised previously he would not support. And so I try to not get into Dem on Dem sort of stuff, but I think it is important that people reach out to our senator here in Pennsylvania and say, hey, it's probably not okay that as the only Democrat, you are going to support this legislation, which is going to disenfranchise millions of women across this country if it becomes law. However, we are in a position right now where we do have the votes to block them bringing this up. So this is one of those instances where the filibuster is actually helpful for us in this very narrow way. And so I do not believe that they will be able to, the way things look right now, to ram through the SAVE Act in the US Senate. And that is really important because when we take over the House, obviously that's going to be dead on arrival, but it is really important that the Senate hold its ground on the SAVE Act because you all understand what that would mean, particularly to women who have been nice enough to take their husbands' last names. Now you're paying for it at the ballot box, but it should be no shock to us because just yesterday at the Department of Defense, I'm not calling it the Department of Nonsense, the Department of Defense, Pete Hegseth's pastor is somebody who has said very publicly he does not believe women should have the right to vote. And he's also said very publicly that he doesn't have that big of a problem with pedophiles. And we all should stop being so upset about pedophiles. I tend to get upset about people abusing kids. And it's unfortunate that the pastor for the Secretary of Defense does not share those same views. But I highlight that not just as a dunk, but I highlight that to make the point that the Republican Party, with the passage of the SAVE Act, is not attempting to secure our elections from interference. They're actually moving closer to a broadly held view among members of this president's cabinet, at minimum, that women should not be able to vote. And that is what the SAVE Act is about at its core. It is going to disenfranchise millions of women who have fought and literally died for the right to vote in the history of this country. So we're going to have to do work not only externally, but we're going to have to do work within our own party, frankly, to push our senator here in Pennsylvania to do the right thing, the people who sent him. I will end there and really just end where I began by saying thank you. Thank you for getting on the damn bridge. Thank you for doing the hard work of making this democracy work. And I'm excited to be in this work with you, as I move forward. So goodbye, everybody. Thank you. Appreciate it.